Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Um, Thanks to those of you who are here. Good to see you. Please enter as it says in the chat, please enter your name in the chat so that I have an attendance record for those of you who are here in the synchronous session. We're going to talk about the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels today. So that's really exciting. The only nuts and bolts kind of announcement I have today is that for some reason I'm having trouble accessing my email through Chico. So I've got to find out what's going on with academic technology. So if you've emailed me in the last couple of days and I haven't responded, that's why. If you need to get a hold of me, it's better to contact me than through Canvas until we can figure out what's going on. So I'm not sure really what's happening with that. But hopefully
Professor.
it'll be restored soon. Hi, Precious.
Hi, good afternoon. I was on my grades, it says for the last two meetings, which I was present, it says I didn't get a score in that. That's normal, right? I shouldn't have a grade if I attended in person.
Yeah, so what I've been doing is manually entering 10 points for everybody who is here in the session.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, so you don't need to watch the perusal video of the lecture if you were here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, okay. Just writing down your names. All right, so we're gonna at least get started with the Manifesto of the Communist Party. It's a bit of a longer read, and there's a lot in there to grapple with. So we might not totally finish it today. If that's the case, then we'll pick it up on Wednesday. The last two readings that you have from Marx come from the famous Das Kapital. The reading that we'll at least start with on Wednesday is about the fetishism of commodities. And then the second reading is on the accumulation of capital. And so once we're done with that, next week, we will start heading into talking about Emil Durkheim. You'll have a quiz before we go to Durkheim that I will talk about in Wednesday's class. As I mentioned on the first day of class and on the syllabus, those quizzes are not really like quizzes like pop quizzes. They are more like take-home tests or open book tests that you have a week to complete. So what I encourage you to do is to open up the quiz when it goes live before Wednesday's class or like at Wednesday's class. Take a look at the questions and then you can, close it out and come back to it. You have a week to basically to complete and submit that quiz. And it'll be all about Marx. It'll be basically the culmination of what we've been doing about the last like 3 weeks. I think that's all the announcements that I can think of at the moment. Any questions before we start with the manifesto? All righty. Let me go to the screen share mode. Pull up the reading. There's a good little introduction here from the editors. before we get into it. I haven't really annotated it. I think it kind of speaks for itself, but there are a couple of things to kind of note about the Communist Manifesto. In some ways, it's kind of misnamed because we'll see that a lot of the Communist Manifesto in the especially in the first part is really about capitalism, the development of what they call modern bourgeois society, or they associate with the rule of the bourgeoisie. So these two terms that they use to describe the different social classes, it's important to sort of get them right. So the bourgeoisie would refer to today what we would call the capitalist class. So, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, Marx and Engels' definition of the bourgeoisie are those who own the means of production. They own the companies, they are the CEOs, they are those who are like the ownership class. Today, we might refer to them as, like the 1%, the people that own a vast proportion of the wealth, and with that, they've acquired a lot of influence over the government. Some people today, refer to them as like the oligarchy, and many of them are now like billionaires, and in Elon Musk's case, may even become trillionaires. So a good way to kind of remember this. I don't know if people still use the word bougie to describe like people who are like snobby or think they're better than that, other people, or are kind of elitist. But so that word bougie comes from like bourgeois. Bourgeois is like a French word that described like people living in cities who made their money through commerce and mercantilism, and then eventually kind of became like the new kings and queens. They replaced the aristocracy as the ruling class in society. The other group is the proletarians, which generally refers to just the working class. Marx and Engels define the proletariat as the people who have to sell their labor in order to survive. And if they can't sell their labor, they don't survive. So it's basically that kind of a very general definition. The bourgeoisie is basically the ownership class. In the case of the proletariat, the only thing that they own is their ability to work. And so they have to sell their labor as a commodity in the marketplace and hope that there's somebody to buy it. So the proletariat is dependent on its ability to labor in order to buy the things that they need to live, their rent and their medicine and their food and all the necessities of survival. So that are important definitions to keep in mind from the outset. Historically, in context, this text, this manifesto, was written in 1848, which was a revolutionary year across Europe. It's not that the Communist Manifesto caused those revolutions. The Communist Manifesto was actually published in February of 1848, and then the revolutions began in the end of February 1848 and throughout March and April. It's sometimes these revolutions are called the springtime of the peoples, because they were like these springtime uprisings that started in Paris in late February of 1848, and then they spread to to Prussia and Belgium. And the thing about revolutions is that they're contagious, right? Like people in one city or one country, kind of ignite the spark, and then it kind of snowballs and spreads to other parts of the world. We saw this in 2011 with the Arab Spring, that started in Tunisia and then went to Egypt and sort of eventually spread to, much of North Africa and the Middle East and East Asia or West Asia. And we also saw it during the Occupy Wall Street, which started in New York City and then spread to Oakland and to many other cities around the country, and eventually around the world. Occupy became like an international kind of movement. So revolutions are contagious in this way, and Marx and Engels are writing in a revolutionary moment. And so the language, the prose of this is very like electric. It's very dynamic. It's very much alive. It's written to be, a manifesto is a political statement, something that is, meant to provoke people to not just think but to act, right? And so this is meant to be a kind of a revolutionary document. And we'll see that the prose of the revolution of the manifesto of the Communist Party is very lively. They use a lot of like Gothic kind of metaphors, and the language is very perhaps at the risk of being simplified, but the prose is very is very biting and very meant to like arouse people. So that is to sort of be kept in mind, the historical context for this piece. The overall flow of the manifesto is that it will it'll start by talking about how capitalism came to be historically, how modern bourgeois society was created. And then as the manifesto goes on, um, they will be arguing that the unintentional result of modern bourgeois society is that it creates the seeds of its own destruction, that it will unintentionally, ironically, create the conditions in which a revolution will overthrow the bourgeoisie. They will make it, the modern bourgeois society creates the conditions in which the proletariat, the oppressed, can organize and rise up and destroy their oppressor. The way that Marx and Engels put this at the very end of the first part of the document is to say the bourgeoisie creates its own grave diggers. In other words, that the bourgeoisie plants the seeds of its own destruction. It is a contradictory development in which those contradictions will result in creating like a kind of revolutionary dynamite that will blow up in their face. And that will eventually lead to, from capitalism to a higher stage of communism. This is what their overall sort of argument is, and how the text kind of flows from beginning to end. In the beginning, they will suggest that basically modern bourgeois society, that capitalism kind of was born in the womb of feudalism, of feudal society that ruled through the Middle Ages, and was dominated by the monarchy and the aristocracy and the kings and queens and that sort of ruling class. And so, in the same way that modern bourgeois society was born in the womb of feudalism, they believe that communism will be born in the womb of capitalism. That's perhaps too many pregnancy metaphors, but I hope you get the idea that like the idea is that these historical changes arise from the contradictions within the existing society, that the future is born from within the present, and that is kind of like how history moves. That's what they call historical materialism. So I hope that introduction kind of gives you a foreshadowing of what's to come here. In the first sentence here, what I've highlighted is like what I said about the revolutionary context of this. One thing that I really like about the manifesto is this kind of Gothic prose. If you'll remember last time I talked about Frankenstein, which was a novel written by Mary Shelley in 1818 that has this kind of Gothic, kind of feel to it, like modern day horror. In this, they are drawing a lot from, in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, they're drawing a lot from the story of Faust. The story of Faust, you may know as like the story of the deal with the devil, a Faustian bargain is where that expression kind of comes from. And so they start with saying a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. So we have, the specter, like a ghost, a boogeyman, that is haunting the ruling classes, as they list them in the second sentence there. And so I've posed this question in 2025: are Marx and communism still specters that are haunting the ruling class? A good example is when Zoran Mamdani won the primary for the New York City mayoral election. He won the Democratic primary. Trump came out and called him a communist, even though Mamdani is not a communist. He calls himself a democratic socialist, which is a different thing. But again, here we have this idea of communism as this boogeyman, this monster hiding in the closet, waiting to come out and cut the throats of the billionaires. And so Guadalupe put a really interesting kind of comment. They make it sound like an impending doom, like it's so threatening to them that the world's leaders united against it. And it's really interesting to think like we live in this time where the Soviet Union is no more. The Soviet Union was the world's preeminent communist power in the 20th century, starting in 1917. But by 1991, the Soviet Union had basically dissolved. And China, which had a sort of communist revolution in 1949, has basically reformed into a point where now, China is better described as like a kind of a state capitalist society, in which they have, the state owns certain kind of enterprises like banking and things like that in a way that they don't in capitalist societies. But still, like China has billionaires, and China has, an oppressed proletariat that goes on strike, people that are manufacturing iPhones in factories across the cities. And so in a lot of ways, China is just kind of another kind of capitalist society today. So communism doesn't even really exist so much, except in small, pockets of the world, say maybe in Cuba. And yet it continues to haunt. It continues to be this specter that's haunting the leaders and the billionaires and the wealthy classes. They continue to speak in these fearful tones about communism. So this is something interesting to kind of start with. is this question again of how the past is still relevant to the present.
Uh,
Um,
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
You were speaking about communism. Wasn't there like a war against communism a long time ago?
Certainly, there have been several.
Ah,
One was right after the Russian Revolution in 1917. All the Western powers, including the United States, aligned in an effort to try to overthrow that communist government that had been started by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia. This created a long civil war within Russia, and the communists won. They basically drove out that alliance of European powers. Then there was a sort of a second iteration in this in the 1950s. This is the so-called McCarthyism and anti-communism. So remember, in World War II, America, the United States, and the Soviet Union had fought on the same side, right? They had been allies against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and the other Axis powers. But after World War II, the United States and Russia are involved in this long so-called Cold War. Um, and that is in the United States accompanied by a campaign of McCarthyism that was called McCarthyism, in which, anybody who had been a communist was like fired from their jobs. There were a lot of people who were teachers who lost their jobs. There were a lot of people in Hollywood who were part of the film industry who lost their jobs. There were all of these trials and accusations and court hearings and this effort to basically root out the Reds, as they called them in the 1950s. This is where the idea of a communist or a McCarthyist witch hunt comes today. And then to some extent, there was even a sequel to that in the 1980s under Reagan. Reagan sort of launched a new Cold War. So there's been several.
was that the war on drugs with Reagan?
So yeah, I mean, Reagan launched a lot of wars, none of which were especially successful. The war on drugs was certainly not successful, unless you think like, well, the real motive for the war on drugs wasn't so much to stamp out the drugs as it was to mass incarcerate
Yes,
huge numbers of people of color and use drugs as a pretext for
the
mass
bigger agenda.
incarceration.
Yeah. And just to get like a better visualized image of it, um, you said something about Russia with the communism
Yeah.
revolution. Is that I could be far off, but is what's going on with Russia and Ukraine some type of communism fight? And if so, who's the communist?
No,
Okay, sorry.
those countries have long since been uh, incorporated into the sort of the Western capitalist order. That war has to do more with Vladimir Putin's desire to um, recapture like what was once part of the Russian Empire, which is Ukraine. It's part of his effort, I suppose you could say, to make Russia great again.
Uh,
Um, you know,
oh, and isn't there like, sorry to cut you off, but isn't there or shouldn't there be some type of law in place that prevents countries from pretty much taking people's land, saying, hey, this was once ours, now we want it back, capitalizing on their land?
well, the law um, is does not operate independently of social relationships. So, like that whole expression, like property is 9/10 of the law. I don't know if you've heard that or not, but it's a common saying
Uh-huh.
among lawyers and people in the legal profession. And so it's basically Marx and Engels, like to go back to the German ideology, they would basically say that like those who own and control the social resources have the power to make the law on their side, you know. So they basically are able to make the legal system work for them, because of their wealth and their power. So the law is never, just like, how we talked about with ideas, are never independent of the social class relationships. We could say the same thing about the legal system. It's always can be changed and modified and twisted around and biased to serve the interests of those with wealth and power.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. Good questions. This what did I write here? Yeah, so this I added just a little bit of historical context in response to Vanessa's point here, that compared to maybe 50 years ago, there isn't really much communism in the world today, right? So in like the 1950s, like half of the world was effectively communist. Russia, China, Cuba has a revolution in 1960. Um, a lot of the Eastern European nations, they all called themselves communist. Since then, what is called communism, essentially has kind of collapsed in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and like I said, in China. China is they still in China they still call themselves a socialist society, but it's really like they're really kind of capitalist. Go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, and this is just a simple question. But further on in the readings, I know that like there have been some communist leaders in the past that weren't great. But
Yeah,
I don't know anything about them. So will we learn about that later on? Or is there something that
big
like
topic.
you can explain like why I guess what my curiosity is like why they didn't work out. Why did they
Yeah,
end up badly if they were trying to follow what Marx wanted, essentially?
it's a big topic. It kind of requires a historical explanation is like beyond the scope of this class. So we won't really get into that. I can say, out of all of the communist leaders who kind of like betrayed the cause, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union is probably number one on that list. Even people who made, the revolution in Russia, saw Stalin as, like a traitor to the cause. I would say the very short answer of this is um, people who are power hungry. In Stalin's case, he was a very power hungry individual who kind of concentrated all the power of the state in his person and executed all the people around him who might be contenders for that power, including people who had made the revolution in the first place, like Leon Trotsky. He had Trotsky executed. Trotsky had gone to Mexico City in exile, and Stalin sent an assassin to kill him in his home.
So to add to that, would you say essentially they weren't actually communists then?
Yeah, um, it's a thorny and complicated thing, and people there's debates and a very like many sides to the debate. I would say that these are examples of followers who betrayed the leader. Um, in that sort of sense of you see this also a lot in religious movements. of those who follow an original prophet and they betray or distort the message of the prophet for any number of self-serving reasons. And this is a thing we see throughout history. This is like, people that just they sort of use the original doctrine and the original ideas for kind of twisted ends. It's hard to really generalize about because you really have to kind of look at the specific historical examples and to understand like why they go wrong, or like there's not just like one answer or a one size fits all answer for this problem, but it is a problem. Like it has been a problem throughout history, whether you're talking about religion or politics or any other realm of society, of um, how an original sort of message is distorted and betrayed by those who follow in its footsteps. So I know that probably doesn't really answer your question, Paige, but it's really like worth thinking about.
No, it definitely helped put it into different perspectives. So thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
Okay, no problem. I'm gonna check in on the chat here. The chat is mostly like people just putting their names in. Let me talk. Yeah. Okay. Um, just checking in on the chat. So this is sort of like background that I think is necessary to understand. And what I would like to do for this class is kind of bracket out some of those historical questions so that we can understand the original text and the original theory and the original ideas. The question of how and why they were later betrayed is something that we'd have to explore further in a different kind of class. So let's try here to kind of as much as we can to kind of put aside that historical baggage and try to focus on this particular text and its original intent. They start off with a very pithy short sentence, but it carries enormous weight and an importance. That the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Now, this I want you to think back to the German ideology when we read the German ideology, and they outlined their theory of what they called historical materialism, which basically emphasizes material factors over ideal factors in understanding the course of history, like what causes change. So they are emphasizing here again the importance of material factors, of class struggles over, material resources like food, housing, medicine, etc. Those kinds of struggles over material resources, they say, are the things that cause history to change. They are the motor force of change. And I want you to think back to the German ideology in order to contextualize why this is important. Because what they're doing is saying like that these kinds of class struggles matter more than, say, like philosophical ideas, like the age of reason or the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment. Those who emphasize the ideal factors in understanding the trajectory of history. They are putting the emphasis here on class struggles over material resources. Now, there's a footnote in here that points to a sort of a historical footnote that Engels added later, where he says basically what they mean here is all written history, because in pre-literate cultures, in cultures where there was no writing, like hunting and gathering societies, those were typically like classless societies. They weren't divided by class. Their property was held in common. Like there was no such thing as private property. There was no real conception of private property, and so therefore there was not like class inequality. There weren't people who owned more than other people, you know. And so in these kinds of so-called primitive societies or indigenous societies, you know, common property is held in common, and we don't see those kinds of class differences, and so therefore we don't see those kinds of class struggles. The development of writing of literate cultures sort of co-evolved with the rise of class society, with agricultural societies that were producing a surplus, and so therefore the question became like, who owns how much of that surplus and who doesn't own how much of that surplus. So you start to see the beginning of these kind of class inequalities. You start to begin to see ownership of things like private property. But that's not how most people throughout the history of the world have lived. The hunting and gathering societies, existed for many centuries before there was the development of private property and class inequality. So Engels is just kind of adding that footnote to say, like, there was a long, long, long time ago societies that didn't have class struggle because there was no private property and there was no like real inequality. Pretty much everybody was just like in the same boat. So he's just kind of qualifying this sentence. In the next sort of paragraph, they describe all the historical forms that this class struggle has taken. So freeman and slave, plebeian, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman. These are different iterations of class struggle, but it all boils down, as they say, in a word, to oppressor and oppressed. So all of these various fights, whatever you want to call the oppressor and the oppressed at different historical stages, it all comes down to this conflict between oppressor and oppressed in society. And that is the thing that sort of creates change. As the ex-slave Frederick Douglass had said, without struggle, there is no progress, right? Struggle is the thing that causes history to move, to change, and it's the struggle over these material conditions. And then in this next section, these next few paragraphs, what follows here is basically a short history of how capitalism, which they call modern bourgeois society, how this developed historically, how it, as they say, sprouted from the ruins of feudal society. Or, like I said earlier, like how it was born in the womb of feudal society, how capitalism emerged within feudalism and then became sort of the dominant class relationship, how it created new class inequalities in the place of old ones. So the idea is that the ruling class under capitalism, the bourgeoisie, emerged from within the previous feudal society, and then that bourgeoisie eventually gained power and became the ruling class. They didn't start out that way. originally, like in the Middle Ages, the ruling class was the monarchy and the aristocracy. They were the kings and queens and princes and princesses and the lords and, this whole sort of aristocratic order. And the bourgeoisie were basically these people that lived in cities and they traded goods and they, maybe did banking and, they were the sort of the money makers, but they were not necessarily the dominant class. The dominant class were the people that ruled over society was the monarchy and the aristocracy. And eventually what happens over the course of history, through the Middle Ages, is that the bourgeoisie becomes more and more powerful, and while the power of the monarchy and the aristocracy declines. And so this is basically a very short history of how all of that happened in the next, like, what is this, like 5, 6 paragraphs. And they put there's a number of events there that you can see that they kind of highlight, but one of them is the discovery of the Americas. Christopher Columbus in 1492. Page posed a really interesting thought experiment. Like if the discovery of America had never happened, would we have seen this same kind of advance of capitalism and the advance of the bourgeoisie? Because there's no question that what happened with the so-called discovery of the Americas is that this allowed the European powers to expand and colonize the Americas, and then to get rich, basically by using like enslaved labor. Originally, the enslaved labor of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, and then later the enslaved labor of people who were kidnapped from Africa. But basically, like the colonization, the so-called discovery and colonization of the Americas is what allowed the Spanish, the British, the French, the Dutch, for these bourgeoisies to become more powerful and wealthy, and to become like the world's leading powers. And so the thought experiment of like, well, what if that had never happened, is like interesting to think about, because in 1492, China was way more advanced than Europe in terms of like technology, mathematics, all kinds of whatever metric you want to use. China and other parts of the East, India, were more advanced. And we see the same thing in like African civilizations, and what will happen is eventually that those civilizations in Africa and Asia are really devastated and kind of thrown backwards by colonization and slavery. And those are the things, colonization, slavery, warfare, those are the things that basically allow Europe to become like the center of world power. And the discovery of Americas, the so-called discovery of the Americas is really an indispensable part of that, in the sense that without that so-called discovery, it wouldn't have happened. World history would have turned out very differently. So that's something really interesting to think in mind, because they like in this paragraph here too, they emphasize how important that that discovery was. So they summarize it here and basically say, well, we see therefore how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of histories, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. So that summarizes what happened in the previous 6 or 7 paragraphs, And it also kind of foreshadows what they're going to eventually say, which is that in the same way that modern bourgeois society came out of feudalism, we will see a communist future that comes out of the capitalist present, that the capitalist society, modern bourgeois society, will create the conditions, like unintentionally. They're not, the bourgeoisie is not trying to destroy itself. It's not trying to create communism by any means, but it will create the conditions in which that becomes possible, in which the bourgeoisie will self-destruct and be overthrown by the proletariat, who will then institute a new and higher stage of communist society. That's essentially their argument. In the paragraph that follows, I've kind of posed a question in addition to making a comment here. So with the preceding paragraphs, they're kind of talking about how like the bourgeoisie acquired more wealth and more like economic power. And here they start talking about how the bourgeoisie acquires more political power, how the bourgeoisie acquires power over the state, over the government. And I posed the question, when people like Bernie Sanders and AOC are talking about an oligarchy, an oligarchy in which we have rule by the rich, and is kind of like the antithesis of democracy. Is what Marx and Engels are saying here like even more true today than it was in 1848, where they say the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. And then they say the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, the whole bourgeoisie. In other words, that the state or the government is not some neutral referee who's like looking out for the interests of everybody, but that the government, the state, is specifically looking out for the interests of the bourgeoisie. That it is biased in the in serving the interests of the wealthy and the ownership class. And if you look at who the executive of the modern state is today, that's a perfect exemplar of that. And their first priority has been to like cut taxes for the super wealthy and pay for it by cutting people's Medicare and Medicaid. So I think we have a pretty good example in our own time of how the modern state is a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. So I pose that question for you to kind of think about and sort of just discuss. What follows here is a really important section. This is like what follows in the next handful of paragraphs is I think the most important section of this reading. And here is where they are going to describe the dynamics of capitalism in terms of how the bourgeoisie has ushered in a new kind of society. If you look at the next several paragraphs, you notice that the first word in every one of these paragraphs is the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie has done this, the bourgeoisie has done that, the bourgeoisie has created this. Like it's the noun in the next, like, what, 10 paragraphs, all of them except this one, right? So the bourgeoisie is the subject of all of these things that follow. They're talking about how the bourgeoisie has created a new kind of society. And when you see the bourgeoisie, again, think like the capitalist ruling class, the capitalist class in terms of what they've done. Here is a kind of a very poetic description, I think, of one of the dimensions of what we called alienation in last Wednesday's class. Pay attention again to the language that they use, because the prose is rather like striking. They describe the cold and callous dynamics of society, where relations between people are reduced to naked self-interest. So like cold, calculating, callous, like like rough, like you get a callus on your foot. It's like the tenderness of the skin is turned into a really rough and hard thing. So in a way, they're basically describing a society that becomes more and more dehumanized, and where people are reduced to cash payment. They're describing a world, as the Wu-Tang Clan described, where cash rules everything around me. This kind of society where the other way that they put it is like, it has resolved personal worth into exchange value. So what people are worth personally is reduced to how much money they have or don't have, you know. And this is it has left, up here earlier, it has left no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned out the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. All these things that people considered to be sacred, to be priceless, to be, untouchable, all get like a price tag attached to them. And when they become, matters of things that you can just buy, then the things that were once sacred are now profaned. They are reduced to a dollar sign. And they continue on this in these two paragraphs. They're basically describing how people and relationships that were once considered sacred are now profaned when they are reduced to matters of money. So these occupations, the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, all these occupations that were revered now become, as they say, stripped of their halo. They were once, revered and honored in society, and now they become reduced to matters of money. They were once looked up to with reverent awe, and now they are merely paid wage laborers. Likewise with the family, this institution that we consider to be sacred, or sentimental, it reduces the family relation into a mere money relation. So that's the common theme with these three paragraphs, is the way that money kind of defiles, it degrades. There's a Bob Dylan lyric from the 60s in which he sings, money doesn't talk, it swears. Like, in other words, you've probably heard the expression money talks, like money talks and shit walks, I think is how it goes. And Dylan says, like, well, it talks, but it talks in this like profane language. It says like, fuck you, pay me. Like it's like money doesn't talk, it swears. you know. And so in that sense, it profanes that which was once considered sacred, and it kind of devalues like tradition, the things that people used to hold up with reverent awe. And you think about it to this day. I mean, when something is for sale or someone is for sale, it's like it like degrades them in some kind of way, you know. Um, the next few paragraphs, there's kind of a surprising turn that takes place, in which here Marx and Engels will discuss how capitalism, for as cold and callous as it is the most innovative and productive economic system in the history of the world. They have no doubt that this is true, that capitalism um, increases the rate of innovation and development at a pace that the world has never seen before. It is they're describing how innovative and productive capitalism can be, much more so than previous modes of production. So they talk about, like, here, the bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. Like slothful is like a lazy creature, a sloth, or like sloth is considered like a sin of laziness. And so they're basically saying, like, the old ruling classes, the kings and queens, the monarchy, the princes and princesses, they were slothful. They basically like rested on their laurels and their wealth and their land and their castles. They didn't have any incentive to really get more. They just kind of passed it down from generation to generation to generation. Whereas the capitalist class is always looking for more. For the capitalists, there is no such thing as like too much. Like, if you're a billionaire like Elon Musk, you want to become a trillionaire. you know if dominate over the earth like Jeff Bezos, you want to dominate space. They're just greed. The greed is kind of built in. And so as a result of that, capitalism is always like, there's just this quest for more, 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 more. There's no such thing as enough. And so this creates a very dynamic, productive economy, at the same time that it's a totally unjust and unstable one. So they continue in this paragraph by saying, it has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. So they're talking here like all these things that are considered like the 8 wonders of the world, like the Egyptian pyramids and the Roman aqueducts and the Gothic cathedrals. Like what capitalism has been able to do in a short period of time, like totally dwarfs all of these, what was once considered the great wonders of the world. You think the pyramids were great? Well, look at the cities that capitalism can build. Like, look at the new factories, the technologies. All of this kind of innovation and production is more than anybody had ever seen throughout the history of the world to that point. So it has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about, just how creative and productive and innovative humanity can be. Right? They're showing this on a kind of a world scale. In the next paragraph, they kind of describe why this is. They are describing what makes capitalism so innovative, productive, and dynamic, and their answer is basically competition. So the competition incentivizes what they call the constant revolutionizing of the instruments of production, the constant development of like new technologies, new forms of communication, new forms of transportation. These innovations come at an accelerated rate under capitalism. So the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them, the whole relations of society. So in the process of introducing all these new technologies and all these new means of communications and new means of transportation, what they're doing is changing the whole fabric of society. They are erasing all the old traditions and creating an atmosphere of constant change, where change is the only thing that is really constant, where we live in a period of accelerated change. And so you get this sense of like that this is a really, like you're on like a really unstable roller coaster. You're living in a capitalist society, where it's going faster and faster and faster, but it's also like kind of out of control, you know, and you never know when it's going to like go off the rails and kill everyone along with it. So an atmosphere of constant change, but also unsustainability. So and that changes the whole social fabric along with it. So they continue and they say, like, conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence of all industrial classes. So the old societies were based on conservation, slothful indolence. The ruling class just kind of was content with what it had, and it didn't really have an incentive to produce more. Whereas the capitalist class is always wanting more. They're always competing with each other. And so there's this drive to constantly revolutionize the instruments of production. And as they do that, they constantly revolutionize the whole fabric of society with it. So in the third sentence in this paragraph, they say constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. So these are the things that are unique to modern bourgeois society. It's this constant revolutionizing of production, this uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, and everlasting uncertainty and agitation. These are the hallmarks of a capitalist society. And so they continue. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is profane, all that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his real conditions with his kind. That last sentence is a real banger. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. Right? So all these traditions and things that we thought were certain about and things that seemed solid are suddenly just like evaporate into thin air. Like neighborhoods are destroyed, communities are destroyed, through like gentrification or something like that today. Like all the things that seemed stable, that seemed like they had the weight of tradition behind them, including like the ways we walk, the way we talk, our fashion, all of these things are subject to this accelerated pace of change. So all that is solid, it melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. All these things that we held up to be sacred, the family, our traditions, our communities, all the occupations that we held up to reverent awe, all of those things are now suddenly profaned because they have a price tag attached to them. Because like money doesn't talk, it swears, So we have this kind of society that is, like I said, like you could kind of imagine, or I imagine it as like this kind of roller coaster, that it's super innovative and moves really fast, but it's also prone to crisis. It seems like it's going to implode any minute. There's going to be a boom followed by a bust. A bubble is going to burst. We're going to go into a recession or a depression, or it's a system that is prone to crisis. It's productive yet unsustainable. And another way to think about this is the phrase creative destruction, which seems like contradictory or oxymoronic. Like, how can you have creation and destruction at the same time? But that's very much like how capitalism kind of operates. Like, I live in San Francisco and I walk around San Francisco, and there's always being something destroyed and something being constructed at the same time, including people's neighborhoods, their communities, are being, destroyed by gentrification, displacement. And, like new condos are always being built, new technologies, all of a sudden, like my neighbors are all working for, AI companies. You get these new people, fresh out of college and moving into my neighborhood in the Mission, you know, and then people that have been in the Mission for, generations are being displaced and having to move out to, Vallejo or, you know, Antioch or Richmond or somewhere else. So it's, you know, like all that is solid melts into air and all that is holy is profaned. I end up muttering those words a lot, just walking around the city. And the cities are where we really see these dynamics in really in intense, accelerated form. This last, the last kind of passage that I want to read, because we'll have to come back to this on Wednesday, but just to kind of get us started with thinking about this next little section, what they're describing, what the bourgeoisie does, is kind of like what we call globalization today. But globalization was not really like a word at that time. And so they're talking about how the bourgeoisie is always looking to expand its markets, i.e., they're always trying to sell more stuff to more people in more parts of the world. And the need of that constantly expanding market is going to chase the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. So it must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So they're saying here is that like what we today call globalization is driven by the bourgeoisie basically trying to sell more stuff to more people in more corners of the world. And so they saw in this almost like prophets, they saw what today we're seeing with like the globalization of these multinational corporations, McDonald's and Disney and, all these entities that are constantly looking to expand into new markets around the world. And what they will do here in the rest in this next paragraph is kind of describe the consequences of that, which means that like local traditions and national cultures become kind of destroyed, and everything becomes, kind of Disneyfied and McDonaldized all over the world. Local musical traditions are replaced with like pop music. Fast food supplants, regional traditional forms of food. There's this whole kind of erasure of the local in favor of the global as the bourgeoisie sort of spreads itself all over the world. So that's since we're going to be talking about Das Kapital starting on Wednesday, that's kind of like where I want to leave this, is because this will be a good place to sort of start off in the next class, is by looking at like this thing that today is known as globalization. Were there any questions out there before we sort of call it a day? We still got a couple of minutes. I wanted to make sure to leave at least a few minutes if there were any questions or comments that people had before we bid adieu for the day.
No, no comments today.
All right. I've left you all speechless. All right. So look, when we resume on Wednesday, this is the passage where we're going to sort of leave off. Here, like I said, the Communist Manifesto is almost kind of misnamed because it's all really about capitalism. This is like, I think in a lot of ways, a very prophetic vision, like as in seeing the future, a prophetic vision of what capitalism has become in our time. And so they're able to see, they weren't like able to predict the future because they had like some crystal ball or whatever. They're able to kind of predict the future because they can understand the dynamics of this system and the direction that it's headed. And so here and in other other parts of this section, we'll see that what they're describing is something that looks very much like our world today. And then they will sort of build an argument for how they think revolutionary change is going to come from the proletariat, from the working class, as a sort of like an ironic, unintentional consequence of these conditions in which the bourgeoisie will plant the seeds of its own destruction and be eventually overthrown by the people that it has been oppressing and exploiting. Let me see. So we got the chat. Okay. All right. Well, if there are no like questions or final comments, we can call it a day. Thank you again to those of you who are here. Helps me remind me that I'm not just like talking to my computer screen like a crazy person. And gives me like a sense of like I like the human interaction part of it, and I hope we can continue that and maybe even increase some of that in the days ahead. So thank you. I bid you a good day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Bye.
Bye, Professor. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Karina.